Hello and welcome. We've been having some technical difficulties as usual, but we have myself here once again back at Tavern Talks here with Corey from Chrysalis Endeavors, and we also have a new guest tonight, James. He's a co-author to the book that we're going to talk about tonight. To start out, sadly, this dwarf is not drinking tonight. He ran out of the ale a little earlier than he probably should have. But I know
I got
that
one for you.
these two have wonderful drinks that they'd like to share with you before we continue our story. So,
All right, so on behalf of DM Grumpy Dwarf, I've got a strawberry blonde ale from Bonfire Brewing in Eagle, Colorado. That'll be for James number one, and I'll close us out tonight drinking my own drink, a peanut butter stout. I'll hand it over to you, James.
All right. Well, I've got a real fine Huckleberry Mead here from the Camas Prairie Winery up here in Idaho. It's very, very nice. Nice local berry, and of course honey. So what's not to like?
awesome. And surprisingly enough, I have my good old water jug, so that's what I'm drinking tonight. But this is not why we are here. We are here to talk to them about some interesting topics that were brought up last stream. Last stream, we talked about the idea of co-DMing. And on top of that, we talked about uh, what it's like to game master in other cultures. And then, of course, we brought up the idea of a historic fantasy, which is why we brought James in here to talk with us as our guest for tonight. So I'm going to hand this off to Corey, and he's going to really give us the laydown of what's going on tonight. And then I'm going to ask a bunch of questions to both of these guys.
Awesome, awesome. So, as you can see behind me here, we're in development, James and I, on a module for Savage Worlds, and that module, the current working title is Savage History in Service of the Tiger, which is historical fiction, which we can talk about historical fiction and writing modules for that in a second. But to give you a little background, when James moved from Japan back to the States after spending a decade there,
Yeah, 9 years to the day.
9 years to the day, so almost a decade there, met his wife there. So, his wife and his three kids are actually Japanese citizens. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
All right. So when he came back, I helped him move from all of his stuff that was in my garage and all the way to Idaho. And on that trip, he had wrote this book to run a module for me as we drove clear across the country, and moved all this stuff to Idaho. And that was kind of how the inception of this module that we're working on is basically a component of that one that he wrote and ran for me as we were kind of driving across the country moving stuff. So that's kind of the impetus of the historical fiction module based on feudal Japan that he ran for me as we were driving. So now we're making it for real. We're gonna put it all together, make a module out of a component of that, maybe make a series of modules about that time period, and then the other interesting thing I'm looking to do with this module, and I've already got some voice talent lined up, is recording the box text. It's like doing a QR code inside the book so that somebody could pick up the module and basically have all the box text read for them by a group of voice actors, James, myself, and some other people that I've kind of reached out to help make this happen for us. So that's kind of the impetus of the module. I'll throw it over to James. Got any other comments? James, that way.
I just wanted to say that the original idea came up because Corey had done something similar for me a year before. I think it was about a year before. Also on another trip, Corey put together and ran for me a historical fiction module, Savage Worlds, based in the Revolutionary War. His kind of tracking my ancestors, or loosely tracking my ancestors. And I had so much fun playing that I wanted to return the favor and do something for Corey. So I worked and put together the one about the Warring States period in Japan, because that's something I knew about at that point.
And of the two, the one to publish is the Warring States period, because we might publish something about James's family later. I think the Warring States period might be more broadly accepted.
Yeah.
Well, that's really an interesting just story of how you guys decided to just, I'm going to write a book, but I'm going to write it about him, and then it just was like a return favor. Now, interesting enough, and the whole idea, especially with getting the voice actors and whatnot. So you're projecting this in a culture that's not, I wouldn't say not known, but not as highly published in the Western world. And what challenges have you guys seen, based both in the mechanics and the tabletop society, that you had to work around or deal with when developing something for feudal Japan?
Do you want me to start off on this one?
Yeah, you start on that one, because you're the I will call out the elephant in the room, that we're three white guys talking about a role-playing game in feudal Japan. So I'm going to throw it over to James to answer that question.
Yeah, exactly. So of course there's a lot of issues that you want to think about, right? That we've been kind of just trying to thread the needle on. I mean, there's simple things like, addresses, name order, stuff like that are all completely different from Western culture, right? I mean, in Japan, they use their family name as their primary form of address. Only usually close confidants or family will use their given names, which makes it confusing when you have a whole clan of people who have the same family name, right? Especially when you're trying to write text for that. You got two brothers who both have the same last name, and you can't just say, Shige-san or something like that, and there's two of them, right? So we have to address how do we do that. Another issue, of course, is pronunciation. Romanized Japanese words and names do not read the way you would expect English to read. They have their own kind of reading style. And once you know it, it's not bad, but until you know that reading style, it's really hard to pronounce Japanese names as they're written in English. So there's that. There's a lot of cultural background that, as Westerners and or Americans, we just don't know about, we don't have, right? And so you have to try to figure out how do you introduce those sorts of things without being exposition man all the time, right, in your box text or anything like that, so that you can still bring in the aspects of the culture that you want to introduce through the module and the aspects of the history without it being overly preachy, overly, seminary. You want it to be an adventure. You want it to have fun with it, as well as being slightly educational, being as it's historical fiction.
What else you got for us?
So that's interesting, because you've stated that it's historical fiction. So this isn't just the issue of coming up with an adventure, but how to bring historical facts. And so maybe that's something we want to dive into, is what have you done to make it historical fiction rather than just historic or fiction? But what blends it?
Yeah, so I'll start off with where I started with that big poem that Corey showed you. Right? I decided I wanted to give him basically a fun history lesson. So it ended up being like over 100 pages or something. It was stupid. It wasn't all text. There was a lot of reference material, maps, stuff like that. So basically, I took about a 50-year period of Japanese Civil War history, and I brought in all the famous people from the Civil War, like Takeda Shingen, Uesugi, Kenshin, Nobunaga Oda, all of them. And I mapped out the timeline of all the back and forth throughout the Civil War, and then I created a character who, through a little bit of railroading, ended up kind of serving with each of them so that he could pass throughout the course of history and see all the major battles and the back and forth and the assassination attempts and stuff like that, while hopefully enjoying himself. So what I wrote for Corey was basically history with an extra guy just kind of hanging out and working his way through all the characters. And then when Corey approached me about actually turning it into modules, we decided to make it a little more historical fiction so that we could break it up in ways that make sense, as well as add in more characters. You know, you have things like we wanted this to be an inclusive module, so not a lot of female samurai in Civil War era Japan, right? So how do we address female characters? How do we bring them in an interesting and engaging way? And so a lot of that, you know, we take a little bit of, you know, myth, kind of throw it in to try to help engage that. But we're still trying to maintain actual events, actual people, you know, famous people in the historical period, and have them interacting with them, participating in real battles and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think if you are looking into wanting to write something with historical fiction, it's about the gaps between. Like, you've got these facts, right? And they line up history. Well, you can't really, I mean, we don't want alternate history roleplay. We want actually historical fiction. So you find those gaps in between the facts and say, here's some place we can play. Here's some place where something could have happened or maybe not, but that's okay. As long as, you know, the major things along the timeline still happen. You know, like when I ran the Revolutionary War one for James, there were things that did happen. And I didn't want it to be an alternate history adventure. I wanted it to be, you know, sorry, you can't say that the British won the war, right? That's not how we're playing the game. So a little bit of that, like James said, is it is a little bit more railroady in that this happens. And you know, when James and I we'll show you some of the Co-DMing box text that we wrote here in a little bit. You'll see what we're talking about. Like, this happens, but we still want to make it interesting. We just don't allow for the characters to change what happens. We say, this happens, now we, because there's time to play in that free space in between. And then we say, okay, now you've done some other things, and now this happens, what do you do? And I think that is one of the challenges of writing a module about history, is that if you don't want to change history, then you do kind of have to have that overtone of, hey, everybody, we're playing a historical fiction game. Some things are just going to happen. There's not going to be an opportunity for you to change history. We're just going to play through it. And it will still be enjoyable, we hope.
And as part of that, we have to say, all right, what are the really important things in this historical context that we actually have to maintain, and what can we fudge a little bit for playability, right? You know, if something that we really want to include both things and they're like 15 years apart, well, maybe we shrink that a little bit, you know, to make it more playable, right? Instead of, all right, 15 years later, you know, what did you guys do?
No, that's an interesting thought. So the other thing is, and this has kind of come from my game master point of view, but players don't listen, period. So when a player derails, is there a point, because of it being actual historic fiction, where you have to be like, we can derail here, but only so far? It's not like you're going to completely derail the entire adventure. You have to still come back and wrap back into the historical event that's supposed to go on.
Yeah, I think that just takes a little, you know, like, remember how we talked last time about over-preparing? I do think that this module is going to have a bit of that, like, here are different little things that you can throw at players, and they can take it and run, but we have some strategies to get you back on track. So, even if they say, we want to go do this thing, okay, we're going to let you go do that, and then there will be an opportunity to kind of circle you back to the main storyline. The other thing that we talked about last session, about kind of some things that you can prepare, which we're writing into this module, are role play quests. So at the beginning of chapter 1, I'm going to hand every character at the table a quest that matches their pre-generated character. And that's the other piece, is we're using pre-gens. We're going to have a set of pre-gens for this module that fit the story. So it's not just like, make whatever you want, and we're going to try and fit you into this historical context. We actually have pre-generated characters, and for each of those pre-generated characters, for each chapter of the module, there is a role-play quest that actually ties to what they're doing. I'm going to jump over to my thing here. So, for example, in chapter 1, there's a role-play quest for now that says, sometime after meeting Takeda Shingen, find an opportunity to confide in Akiori about a loss that you feel or a secret desire that you have. So, and in the story, there will be a great loss for that character that you can try and get them to roleplay. So having those quests per chapter is going to allow not only for some roleplay to happen and to give them agency in the storytelling, but it's also going to keep that agency in that storytelling that they're contributing to the big plot line in general. So, and that in Savage Worlds, that's we call that a Benny quest, right? When you do this, you get a Benny, but you have to wait until that trigger, that win, sometime after this, because if you do it too early, it doesn't help tell the story.
And some of that we can kind of try to help rein in via how we write the module. Some of it is up to the GM on how they want to handle things. Like if someone's like, all right, I draw my sword and try to kill the main character of the entire adventure. Well, you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes, right? That's just the way it is, Or if they do something amazing that cuts out a bunch of stuff you had planned, you just have to roll with it sometimes. I mean, I ran a Ravenloft, adventure years ago with characters who had some cool items from a previous adventure, and they bypassed like 3/4 of it and killed the vampires. And I was like, okay, well, you guys are awesome, and we're done.
So yeah, that brings up two questions. The first one is since it is historic fiction, and you have pre-generated characters, I'm guessing this isn't going to have actual fantasy in it.
Right, this is not Legends of the Five Rings. Yeah. This is...
Yeah, there won't be any magic, but there's a lot of martial art type stuff, right? I mean, it is still Japan, so you're going to have, swords and bows and arrows and, maybe some throwing stars. Who knows, depending on how people play. And a battle fan. Which was a thing to show who's the boss.
Go ahead.
So then that brings up to the second question is this something that you guys are doing more wanting to do it more in an educational sense, or is this something that would legitimately be a exciting and well-rounded role-playing game? Because
so I think that we hope to launch this at Genghis Khan here in Denver in February and run it at a table as a 4-hour session. It is a smaller module because it isn't, like I said, we want to keep to it's not a whole campaign setting. It's kind of a one-shot module. We're hoping to do more of them to kind of keep going after, the Tiger of Kai, Takeda Shingen, finishes that story. We hope to jump to one of the other characters during that period and follow them a little bit. So, we hope to do some of these. And I do hope that it draws people just because it's like, wow, this looks fun. This is like, I'm learning a little bit about feudal Japan. I'm being involved. And like James said, we don't want it to be preachy or a lecture or anything. We want it to be a fun story that people get involved in. Kind of like when you sit down to watch Vikings, right? That's historical fiction. And there are things that happen in that TV show that kind of really happened, but they added a lot of flavor and stuff to the show. So we wanted to have that same kind of feel where you feel like you're in feudal Japan and you're participating and you're yes, you're learning some stuff, but mostly you're being a part of a story that unfolds. And the benefit is if you talk to somebody about it, like think about talking about a role play session to somebody at work. A normal D&D role play session, you go into the office and you're like, and my character, who's a wizard elf, yeah, and they're like, yeah, I don't know, yeah, okay, sure, whatever. You go into the office and you talk about this adventure, and you're talking about real stuff that really happened, and they can, if they have any interest in feudal Japan, it could lead to a real conversation. Whereas you kind of have to talk to people in the office that like D&D to talk about your, fantasy adventures in the D&D world.
Well, and plus you have to, you have to kind of balance it out with people's play styles, right? Some people, they really like sandboxes, right? They want to create their characters from the ground up. They want to think of all their own backstory, and then they want to go and play in some big wide world, right? And then some people, want to come in and take an established character with a backstory that then they can flesh out a little bit, or that they can, play with, right? And then go home after a few hours, right? We're kind of hoping to do the latter, right? We're hoping it's a really fun experience where you can sit down, you gain a little bit of historical knowledge, hopefully without it seeming like you did, and you have a good time playing some pretty neat characters. It's the difference between a sandbox, I guess, and a participatory movie or something, or improv theater, I guess.
Yeah, so that's what I'm every time I hear about this. So it brings back something I did when I was in middle school. Our teacher was like, "All right, each of you are part of this castle, and you're going to learn medieval Europe through their actual jobs and what they did and who they were." And I was like, okay. And this to me just sounds like a very much more interactive, much more immersed version of something like that. And personally, I can't say I don't love Japan, but there are parts of Japanese history that I've had to do for college that have drawn me away from Japanese history. But that was my own fault, going through manuscript text from before the 1600s was the most brutal thing I've ever had to do.
Oh yeah, Kobun is tough.
So
no fun.
Yeah, but on the other end, seeing actual things that actually happened and being able to say, you know what, even though it's a game, like I can, if you're GM, and this really does come down to the GM for to have a lot of emphasis in this. If he can really bring those emotions that happened during a civil war or during a major conflict in history and bring those to life, it can be a very intense, very high emotion game that you're going to walk out there, you're going to walk after a 4-hour game exhausted just because of neural overload from such an amazing adventure. And I've done it before as a game master where I walk away and I'm like, I need to go take a nap. Like, this is just exhausting.
Well, and the other thing that we hope around this is that, we're also writing it with the thought in mind that there will be two GMs, which has come back to the core of this kind of thing is co-GMing, right? Because we don't want it to be preachy, because we don't want it to be a lecture, we want to really personify the different aspects of the story. And part of that, a couple things can happen there. One, you can actually split the party with two GMs. These people can go do some reconnaissance or do something, and these people can go do something else. And you have two GMs kind of doing the side quest type things with people. But the other part of that is, as you're telling the story, you can tell the story from two different perspectives at the same time instead of just reading a bunch of box text to them to try and tell the story. So what I'd like to do now, and James and I you got the document up, James?
Yep.
All right, so I think what we want to do is kind of go through towards the end of chapter 1. There's this big scene, and when we're talking about things that just happen, this is one of those things that kind of just happens. This is the way it is. We both kind of get in there and tell this about page and a half of box text, and then turn it back over to the character to see how they react. And this is, and I guess afterwards we'll kind of give you the opportunity to say, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? And see where we go. Which side do you want, James?
I don't care. We haven't really practiced this, so either side equally is good.
Okay. All right. Well, then I'll take Kamihara.
All right.
So I'll start. As the gates of the courtyard of Uehara Castle. Thank you. That's why I have James here, because I'm still having problems pronouncing things. As the gate to the courtyard of Uehara Castle is breached by the footmen of Takeda Shingen's army, Lord Kamihara calls for his guards to fall back into the courtyard and lay down arms in hopes that this attack would not end in the all-out slaughter of his people. It took a few minutes for his forces to comply, as his archers atop the walls continued to rain down arrows into the assaulting host. The calls for surrender finally reached the ears of all within the castle.
It took Takeda Shingen nearly 2 hours to climb with his honor guard to the castle gate. The fortification had fallen much faster than he had anticipated. His soldiers and cavalry had to be reined in, and the larger battle across the valley and near the lake had to be resolved without losing forces, well pulling back to the captured capital.
Lord Kamihara sat in his regal pose with his legs tucked beneath him and his wakizashi across his lap. He hadn't known that he would be sitting this long, and his resolve and the muscles in his lower back began to waver. He glanced around the courtyard and began to wonder about his trusted friend and quartermaster, Araragoro. Had he survived the battle? His eyes fell upon Maruyama Hajime, the man who had assured him that Takeda Shingen, the Tiger of Kai, was nowhere near Suwa. Was he just negligent in his duties as an advisor, or was he a traitor and should not have been trusted?
Lord Takeda, called a lieutenant from just outside the gate. We captured this samurai who was leading a push up the northern slope. I believe him to be Uehara Yoshio, Lord Kamihara's trusted general. The lieutenant pointed to an unconscious man being carried by 2 soldiers. Bring him along, in case Kamihara needs any further evidence of his defeat, replied the Tiger of Kai as he took a powerful stride into the castle courtyard.
The sight of Uehara's unconscious form draped across the shoulders of the 2 soldiers disheartened Kamihara. During these last couple of hours, he had held some small hope that his trusted general would fly in at the last moment and miraculously save the day. With this fantasy harshly squashed, he steeled himself for what was now inevitable. I greet you, Takeda, and humbly ask that we discuss the terms of my surrender and the future of my people.
Takeda looks around. You fought well, but I admit to some surprise at the ease of our victory. I don't know what need I would have for forces such as yours.
Kamihara a bit haughtily. Our intelligence effort were inadequate, and we were unprepared for the forces you brought against us. I assure you that had we had time to fortify our defenses, we would have been a much greater challenge. My warriors are brave and skilled.
Well, that as it may be, it may be better to just make a clean sweep and install my own men here.
Allow me to take the dishonor of defeat solely upon my own head. In exchange, I will instruct all my men, of whom there are still many in the valley, to serve you faithfully. My son, Keisuke, will be a great asset to your forces as you continue to push up into northern Shinano.
That would be acceptable. It would be a shame to waste available talent. Who would serve as your second?
Kamihara, looking to Maruyama. Where is my son? He can serve as my second. Maruyama. I'm sorry, my lord. I heard that he was wounded. I believe that Kyurgens are tending to him now. Kamihara, looking down. I appear to be even more destitute in men of sufficient stature than I thought. Lord Takeda, if you swear to take my people as your own, I would be honored if you would attend me and stand as my second.
Lord Kamihara, a most noble offer. I accept. Your men will be brought into my army. Your son will continue your line here at Ueyama, and I swear to treat yours as my own.
Kamihara pulls his blade and prepares himself for what he must do and thinks of his daughter. I hope that now reaches safety, for there is none guaranteed here. Amaterasu guide her steps.
Takeda steps behind and to the side of Lord Kamihara and draws his own blade, raising it high and ready to end the old lord's life with a single powerful swing to the neck.
Kamihara turns his head and the two men's eyes lock in an unspoken understanding.
Takeda makes a nearly imperceptible nod as if to say, trust me, this will be quick.
Lord Kamihara stabs into his own abdomen and draws his blade through his stomach, and suddenly, as he begins to withdraw his own organs, Takeda swings, and he lives no more.
Fearing the worst, you approach the castle with your weapons stowed. The enemy soldiers escort you into the courtyard, and you see what can only be Takeda Shingen, the Tiger of Kai, standing with a group of his lieutenants. He is an imposing man whose lacquer armor gleams with gold and red. Green bas-relief tigers are engraved on his chest piece, and a demon's face sits atop his helmet. He gestures with his metal war fan, a baton with a wide rectangular end, as he talks to his men. The corpse of Lord Kamihara is being prepared for burial. His body is draped in a white sheet with no visual evidence of the brutal seppuku ceremony. What do you do?
Well, like we were saying, that's kind of, this happens, right?
Right.
Some of the characters are related to Kamihara. Some of the characters, all of the characters previously served him. And, it's one of those pieces that this is at the end of chapter 1, and the name of the module is in service of the tiger. So it's how they got to serve Takeda and serve the Tiger of Kai in that part of history.
Okay. I'm trying to see, because it sounds fantastic. And I'm trying to play devil's advocate just a little bit to give you guys some more thought on it.
This is still in development stages, so now's the time.
Yeah, so and anybody who watches this either now or in the future, please put your comments below. But this is where player understanding with the game master would have to be very solid compared to a game like I've played or that I run on a normal basis, where you give the players the agency to do whatever they want. There are always consequences to what they do, but you give them that agency to do so. This is a little more difficult because you're following a storyline that no matter what has to happen. There is no option.
Yeah, and there's there is no way to save Kamihara. And then if they show up and you say, what do you do? And this goes back to those quests, right? There's one of the quests that is given to one of the two brothers that basically says, in an appropriate time, keep your brother from going off the deep end, just in case. One of the brothers says, well, I walk in, I see the dead body of our Lord, and I attack the Takeda, right? I just brush him, charge, right? +2 attack, -2. Here we go.
Right, and you're surrounded by super high level mobs,
Right, so you do run into that problem, and I warn my players all the time. I was like, if you attack a guard, expect the guard to whoop your butt the first time. It's not gonna. It's just how this works, because when you start to develop your characters, especially at a low level, they're not supposed to just be able to wipe out a town guardsman or slaughter half a village in at level 1. It just doesn't make any sense. And something that is interesting about this, and it's something that it's way out of my wheelhouse, but I'm excited to at least try it, is that you now have pushed more into the idea of interactive history rather than interactive storytelling. So you're cutting pieces, and we've talked about this, I think, in stream 1, where you always want to have that start, that beginning scenario that really hits the players. But with a one-shot, it's difficult because you have to have, and especially with history, now you've got to have 2 or 3 of these to make sure that the story follows through with the historical content. Now, when you guys are designing this, and I know you guys had stated it's 100 pages, but for the actual module itself, how many pages, or how big do you think it's actually going to be?
Not going to be 100.
No. His 100-page thing was about the whole Warring States period. So this one, and we're gonna do this one. Record the box text, do as much as we can, but stopping with the basically the takeover of Shinano, and that piece of history is where we're stopping. And then we'll see how it goes. Play it a few times at some conventions. Throw it up onto Drive-Through RPG. See what our comments coming back are before we go for another one.
Yeah, and it's also obviously the box text that we just went through. That's the end of the first chapter, of the first part of the adventure, right? So they've already gotten their introductions out of the way. They've already had a couple encounters. They've had to make some roleplay decisions already. So either they were subdued or they turned in their weapons, right? So like by the time they get to where all right, what do you do now? Hopefully nobody's just going to be like, I'm going to Leroy Jenkins the whole castle, even after I already agreed to either put down my weapons, and I'm a samurai, which means the code of honor is a real thing, or else you cut your own stomach, right? And so, or you're going to attack them unarmed, and chances are you don't have that skill. So there is definitely some of that, right? There's a lot more lines on the ground to look at, and I hadn't ever played anything like this until Corey did the one for me on the Revolutionary War, but it was some of the most fun I've ever had, and it was a one-person adventure. Like, he did it just for me while we were on a camping trip, and I was engrossed the entire time.
Well, that's awesome, and that's something that we can talk about at another time. Is how do you play a one-to-one adventure? Like, I know a lot of us, we love to play, but sometimes the hardest thing is finding enough players to play. Sometimes it's working that schedule well, and one of the ways to do that, to keep your story growing, is through these one-off 1v1 adventures where you can take a player and you can either directly interact with that player through his backstory or through a side direction that you're running a player, and develop them single-handedly for when you all can come back to the table. But that'll be a different topic completely. As for the co-DMing thing, so the way it sounds, and this is just my own thought on this, is that you guys are just bouncing from text to text. Now, is there legitimately in the book itself spots that says, well, this guy reads this, the next guy should read this? Like, or is it just, I'll read the first one, you read the second one?
So right now it's basically different color text for the different perspectives. But that's, if you wanted to run this just by yourself for a group of people, we want different options. We want you to be able to co-DM with somebody. We also want you to be able to run it by yourself. We also want you to be able to click that QR code and Bluetooth your speaker on the table, and we'll run it for you as far as the box text work. So I mean, that's kind of the um, that we're hoping that it can be something that people enjoy, even if they don't. Because like the DM can pick up this, breeze through it, and then run it, and be right there with the players, learning the stuff as they play with the players. So
That's an interesting thought. So one thing that I've developed over time is the idea of the game master learning at the exact same time that the players are learning. These types of modules you're starting to see develop more and more, where it's not just a fun game to play, but it's a fun read for the game master. And that technically is one of the main reasons why I had connected with Gooey Cube in the first place, and then meeting Corey and seeing how he does his things as well. My Something I bring up to my players all the time and other game masters that have asked me questions is the idea of two. And that is the fact that you always have a main NPC that's talking, and you don't want more than maybe 1 to 2 max side NPCs at a time, because especially if you're somebody like me who doesn't have perfect voice acting lessons, who can change his voice at a whim, it's extremely difficult to go from speaking to one person to speaking to another person, and then now the NPCs have to talk to each other, and you just sound like a crazy person at that point. So when you do that kind of thing, and the box text is definitely a unique way to do it, is you give the opportunity to give multiple perspectives from multiple different angles very quickly without the confusion of who the hell's talking, because that is a big problem that you run into in a lot of modules. Is the writing is there, and the writing is there to talk as this person, but when it starts bouncing from the orc to the elf and the elf to the dwarf, those are 3 very hard accents to adjust with very quickly. And if you're talking in a conversation wise without the players or with the players, who's speaking to what player and who's speaking to which NPC gets very confusing very fast. So I always go with 2. That's my like
the rule of two
yeah,
NPCs, and that's it.
yeah.
And they don't
Rule of
like to
2.
talk to each other. They hate each other. Right? So I gotta want to throw in here some co-DMing do's and don'ts. All right. So one mistake, and actually James and I made this mistake co-DMing, I think from a visit, was good cop, bad cop co-DMing. I ran the story in the NPCs. James ran the bad guys in combat. And to this day, there is one of those players that's like, has it out for James. Like, just does, it's like just from that one session where he was the bad cop in the session. So to me, that's a don't, right? Divide up the story, divide up the NPCs. Do not divide it up into a storyteller and a rules person that does the combat, because that makes that role, that second role there, the bad cop, and people are just not, it's not very fun for that person, nor does that create a good relationship, outside of game, right? Because
Yeah.
all they got to know about that person was that their job was to kick their ass. And
Yeah, because it wasn't just it was for a random session. It was a group I'd never played with except for like one other person. I was in town, and Corey's like, "You want to come and help me run a session?" So yeah, like you said, there's some bad feelings from that because I was rolling all the 20s for the bad guys, and they were unhappy.
yeah, so that's a don't. A do is definitely, like you were saying, divide up those NPCs. Kind of say, hey, you're going to take these NPCs, these perspectives. I'm going to take these NPCs, these perspectives. Another thing is, do have conversations before any session, especially if you're co-DMing a session that's not like a written module, about what the outcome of that story should be, so that one DM doesn't take people this direction and another DM takes people another direction. Both people have to know where the story's going, at least the major plot lines, and then feel free to how do I put this? feel free to poop in each other's sandboxes. You can make mistakes with each other. You know, it's like, hey, I'm going to do this, and I hope it's all right with them because it's cool for the story, and I'm going to run with it. And you have to kind of be able to adjust and be like, oh yeah, okay, we can switch and move that way. So, like you were saying before, it is kind of like a little improv bit when you're co-GMing.
So that's...
And, you know, it's,
Oh, you go.
sorry, I was just going to say, it's also kind of like parenting, right? You have to provide the united front. You can't let the players play off one another. Like, well, but Corey said we did this. No, you don't want that situation.
But Dad lets me re-roll ones.
Right? Corey said I got another Benny for that. No, you didn't.
So that's an interesting thing. Is that something I actually play with I tell my players no matter if I'm starting a brand new campaign or I've been playing with them for years, at the beginning of the campaign I always tell people the ideas are, and this goes both with the players, is I want you to be able to allow me as a game master to pull you in directions that you might not expect. And part of that is if I say something is happening in the world and it mightn't make complete sense with your character, please run with it, because otherwise the story just gets weird. And I think as a game master, as a co-game master rather, you almost have to do that without any sort of doubt in your mind that if Corey says this, then I've got to run with this, and if you say this, well, then I've got to be on my toes for this. And I've heard, it's very rare, but I have heard in some communities where they'll bring in for specific types of bosses. Normally it's bad characters who have some sort of high intelligence, and they bring a different person to come play them in order to get a different perspective that they might see. But there's also a lot of talk behind it. It's not an instant just, you're playing the bad guys tonight. Here you go, bye. We're going to start the game in about 10 minutes. So there's a lot more that goes behind the scenes on that kind of thing. So do's and don'ts of GMing, co-GMing. The only one I would say the difference would be is if you have a co-GM and they're newer, don't be afraid to let them run a little bit of the game, but at the same time just make sure that they're there to help you as the main storyteller, and that can be anything from keeping the game moving to, hey, real quick, can you track or can you run these baddies real fast while I'm running the main guy or whatnot. But yeah, I do agree with you the same way is if you're going to co-GM, you have to co-GM both sides, which means you can't all be, one guy can't be all the bad guys and one guy can't be all the good guys, because it just, sooner or later, somebody's going to get their feelings hurt, which we know it's a game, but for some reason, and I've heard this from so many people, and it's really weird to say, is that though this is a game, this is the most realistic game you will ever play, because you still feel the emotions, you still have those experiences. And I can personally state that I have friends of mine that I haven't played with in years, and the next time we probably talk, the first thing they're going to bring up is when we killed the stupid beholder. Like, it's just, this is what happens in life anymore. And they're so unique experiences that you don't get normally. You can't tell people that you slayed a dragon because it doesn't exist, but to your friends it does because you spent 6 months doing it. So, no, it was great having you guys here. Corey, it's always fun. James, please come back again to talk more about this as you guys continue to develop this. We'll come up with more questions as we continue to grow. I'm sure the audience will, when they're awake, will show up and come hang out with us. So, but yeah, no, it's been a great time. Thank you both for coming. And next week we will be speaking. I'm going to go through, I'd like to go through a series, and I haven't brought this up to Corey yet, but I'm going to bring it up now because it's what I do.
Hey, Co-DMing, I gotta run with it, right?
Right. So what I would really like to do, and it's something that a lot of game masters state you should do, is we're going to walk through the DMG. We're going to walk through the ideas of how to be a game master, and not only what the book says, but how we can give you opportunities and tips and tricks to improve that and enhance that. So that'll be our start for next week. Until then, clink your glasses, and we will see you back at Tavern Talk next week. Have a wonderful night.